Heavenly Stories.
Clapperboard hook, first seconds. What would you do if you heard your people were living in ruins, if the city of your ancestors, the place that carried your identity, was broken, burned, and mocked by enemies? Would you stay comfortable, or would you risk everything to rebuild what others said was impossible? Nehemiah's story didn't begin with bricks, stones, or blueprints. It began with a broken heart. He was far away from Jerusalem, serving in the royal palace of Persia, a trusted cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. From the outside, his life seemed stable, even prestigious. But one conversation changed everything. News came from Jerusalem, carried by travelers. The walls of the holy city lay in ruins, its gates burned, its people vulnerable and ashamed. The report pierced Nehemiah's soul like a blade. He wasn't there to see the devastation with his own eyes, but the image burned into his spirit. He wept. He fasted. He prayed for days. This was no ordinary sadness, this was the burden of leadership, a holy stirring that God places in the hearts of those chosen to stand in the gap. Nehemiah knew something many forget: a city without walls had no safety, no dignity, no future. Enemies could strike at will, and the people's confidence was shattered. To rebuild the walls was not just about stone and mortar, it was about restoring identity, faith, and hope. But how could a cupbearer, a servant in a foreign land, rebuild an entire city? The odds were against him. The risk was enormous. One wrong word before the king could cost him his life. Still, Nehemiah did what true leaders do. He prayed with boldness, confessing not just the sins of his people, but his own as well. And then he asked God for favor to do something that looked impossible. When the moment came, Nehemiah's heart pounded. The king noticed his sorrow. "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" the king asked. In that instant, Nehemiah whispered a silent prayer. He had no rehearsed speech, only a desperate faith that God would give him the words. He spoke of Jerusalem's ruins. He spoke of the disgrace of his people. And then, miracle of miracles, the king didn't punish him. Instead, Artaxerxes granted permission, letters of authority, and even royal resources to go and rebuild. It was as if heaven had opened the doors. What others thought was impossible, God was already aligning. But Nehemiah's journey was only beginning. Ahead lay enemies who would mock and threaten, people who would doubt, and challenges that would test his faith and leadership at every step. The rebuilding of the wall wasn't just a construction project, it would become a spiritual battle, a story of courage, unity, and trust in God's plan. This was no ordinary mission. This was destiny. Clapperboard hook, first seconds. Have you ever walked into a place that once thrived, only to find it shattered and silent? What would you do if the future of your people rested in your hands, and everyone around you doubted you? Night had fallen over Jerusalem, and the city lay quiet under a blanket of stars. Nehemiah moved carefully through the broken streets, each step echoing off the rubble-strewn walls. Torch in hand, he wasn't just a visitor, he was a man on a mission, a servant of God sent to measure the heart of a city, and the courage of its people. The walls were a scar across the landscape. Gates hung like broken teeth, and stones that once symbolized safety and faith now lay in piles of ruin. The smell of smoke lingered in the air from long ago attacks, mixing with the dust of neglect. Nehemiah's heart ached, but his eyes were sharp. He memorized every crack, every gap, every weak point. He did this in silence, knowing that the enemies of his people were watching from afar. Word of a cupbearer inspecting Jerusalem could be twisted into a threat, an excuse to stop the restoration before it even began. But Nehemiah didn't care. Leadership often requires courage in the shadows, unseen by others. This was his first test, the survey. He couldn't rely on rumors, reports, or hope, he had to see for himself. As he traced the outline of the walls, he whispered prayers under his breath. Not for himself, but for the people who had suffered for decades, for the children who would grow up behind strong gates, for the faith that needed to be restored. The enormity of the task hit him. How could a single man, even with the king's permission, rebuild walls that seemed impossible to repair? Yet, as he stood there in the dark, a fire ignited within him. This wasn't about stones or mortar, it was about restoring life, dignity, and hope. Nehemiah knew something crucial: a vision without a plan is just a dream. He memorized the weaknesses, noted the strong points, and began silently strategizing. Each step forward was a prayer, each observation a piece of the blueprint God was laying in his mind. But the night also brought a haunting truth: enemies would not wait patiently. From the shadows, whispers of mockery and threats would rise. Skepticism among the people themselves would be harder to overcome than any physical obstacle. Nehemiah returned to his temporary quarters with his soul heavy yet resolute. He had seen the devastation firsthand, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. Leadership demanded more than courage, it demanded trust in God's plan, even when the path seemed impossible. The city may have been in ruins, but Nehemiah's vision was blazing brighter than ever. Clapperboard hook, first seconds. What happens when hope feels impossible, but a leader refuses to quit? When fear and doubt surround you, can one voice ignite a city? The morning sun crept over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the broken stones of the walls. Nehemiah stepped outside, his heart racing, not with fear, but with purpose. Today, he would speak to the people. Not as a distant official, not as a stranger from a foreign land, but as one who carried their pain, their shame, and their hope. He gathered the elders, the craftsmen, the mothers, fathers, and even the young men who still remembered the stories of Jerusalem's glory. They were hesitant at first, weary from years of defeat and neglect. Some doubted that walls could ever rise again, some feared retaliation from enemies. Nehemiah looked at them, his eyes fierce yet filled with compassion. "The God of heaven himself will give us success," he said. "We are not rebuilding for ourselves alone. We are restoring the name of our people, our faith, our city. Stand with me, and let us rise together." A murmur ran through the crowd, small at first, then growing into a chorus of agreement. The people began to feel what Nehemiah had felt in that quiet night survey: the walls weren't just stones, they were a symbol of life returning to a wounded city. They started in sections, each family taking responsibility for the part of the wall nearest their home. Nehemiah assigned workers strategically, pairing strong men with those who needed guidance. Tools rang against stones, sparks flew, and the air filled with determination. But opposition was never far away. From the hills, enemies sneered and mocked. "What are these weak men doing? Will they actually rebuild these walls?" they shouted. Sabotage, threats, and fear tried to infiltrate the hearts of the people. Nehemiah responded with vigilance and prayer. He stationed guards, kept the workers alert, and reminded them that God's plan was bigger than any human intimidation. Every stone laid was an act of faith, every mortar-filled crack a declaration that Jerusalem would not remain broken. By nightfall, progress was visible. A stretch of the wall that had been nothing but rubble now stood upright, firm and defiant. The people were exhausted, their hands blistered, yet their spirits soared. Nehemiah walked among them, offering encouragement, wiping sweat and tears alike. "This is only the beginning," he reminded them. "Together, we will finish what was destroyed. Together, we will restore our home, our dignity, our God's glory." Fire in that moment, a city that had known despair began to feel hope. Every brick became more than stone, it became a promise, a prayer, and a testament to leadership fueled by faith. Clapperboard hook, first seconds. Imagine building hope with your own hands while whispers of danger close in from every shadow. Could you keep faith when fear stalks your every step? The sun rose again over Jerusalem, but the city was not at peace. Nehemiah knew that rebuilding walls was never just a physical task, it was a spiritual battle, and the enemies of God's people were relentless. From the surrounding hills, the adversaries of Judah watched with envy and malice. They mocked, threatened, and plotted to stop the progress at every turn. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, names that carried fear, sent messages dripping with derision. "What do you think you're doing?" they sneered. "A broken city will never rise again. You're foolish to even try." Yet Nehemiah remained unmoved. He didn't reply with anger or intimidation. Instead, he prayed. He knew that the real battle was not against men, but against fear, discouragement, and doubt. "Lord, strengthen us. Let them see that your power is greater than any enemy," he whispered. The people were scared. Some considered stopping, believing the mockers. But Nehemiah's presence was like a spark to dry wood. He encouraged the workers, walking among them with his staff in hand, reminding them that God's eyes were upon their labor. "Don't be afraid of them. Remember, the Lord is great and awesome." To protect the workers, Nehemiah devised a bold plan. Half of the men worked with tools in hand, while the other half held swords, shields, and spears. Mothers and daughters carried supplies, watched over the gates, and even participated in the labor. It was a city united under purpose and faith, each person a vital part of God's plan. Attempts to intimidate escalated. Spies and rumors spread fear, claiming that rebellion would come from within, that the workers were too weak, that the walls would crumble. But Nehemiah would not let division destroy what God had set in motion. He reminded the people of the miracles that had already begun, of the favor they had received from the king, and the courage that had carried them this far. Every threat only strengthened their resolve. Night after night, enemies tried to frighten the builders, but dawn after dawn, stones were laid, walls rose higher, and the city's heartbeat grew louder. Through sweat, fear, and resistance, Nehemiah demonstrated a truth that would echo for generations: leadership is not about avoiding danger, it's about guiding others through it. Faith is not passive, it acts, even when opposition surrounds it. By the end of that intense season, significant portions of the wall were restored, and the people's courage had doubled. The enemy's words grew weaker in the face of the city's determination. Every stone became a testimony: God was in the midst of Jerusalem, and no threat could stop his plan. Fire against ridicule, fear, and attacks, Nehemiah's leadership turned despair into action, weakness into strength, and chaos into unity. Clapperboard hook, first seconds. After months of sweat, fear, and relentless opposition, imagine standing before a wall that was once rubble, and realizing that every stone tells the story of faith, courage, and unity. Could you feel the power of a dream fulfilled? The day had finally come. Jerusalem's walls were nearly complete, each stone a testament to the courage and determination of its people. Nehemiah stood at the gate, his eyes scanning the rising structure. It was more than a wall, it was a miracle in motion, a symbol that God's hand had guided every effort, every brick, every prayer. Months of planning, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had brought them here. The enemies had not relented, but neither had the builders. Families had worked side by side, warriors guarding the walls while their neighbors labored, and the city had transformed before their very eyes. Nehemiah called the people together. He raised his voice over the bustling crowd, a voice filled with emotion and authority. "This is the Lord's work," he declared. "It is not by our strength alone that these walls stand, but by the faith of our people and the hand of God. Rejoice, for today we reclaim what was lost, and restore what has been broken for generations." Tears streamed down the faces of the elders, the women, the children, and the men who had lifted stones with blistered hands. They had witnessed what once seemed impossible, and now it stood firm, a fortified Jerusalem, a restored home. The city erupted with celebration. Trumpets sounded, and prayers of gratitude filled the air. Nehemiah led a procession around the walls, showing the people the areas that had been completed, the gates restored, and the sections that now symbolized safety and hope. But amidst the joy, Nehemiah reminded them of the lessons they had learned along the way. He spoke of perseverance in the face of fear, unity in the midst of doubt, and the power of faith when human strength seemed insufficient. Every challenge, every insult from their enemies, every moment of exhaustion had become a stepping stone toward victory. Even the threats of Sanballat and Tobiah, the mocking words from afar, had not succeeded in halting progress. In fact, each attempt to discourage the builders had only strengthened their resolve. Nehemiah had shown that leadership is not measured by the absence of opposition, but by the courage to act despite it. As the sun set over Jerusalem, casting golden light on the newly restored walls, the people stood together, filled with pride and hope. The city that had been broken, vulnerable, and shamed now stood strong, a beacon of God's faithfulness and human determination. Nehemiah's story was more than the rebuilding of walls, it was the rebuilding of hearts, faith, and identity. It was proof that with courage, unity, and trust in God's plan, even the most impossible tasks could be completed. Clapperboard hook, first seconds. Imagine walking through a city that was once in ruins, now alive with hope and purpose. Could you feel the heartbeat of a people reborn? This is where faith, leadership, and destiny collide. With the walls of Jerusalem fully restored, the city was no longer a symbol of shame, it was a declaration of resilience. The people gathered inside the gates they had rebuilt, families standing together, elders raising their voices in praise, children running along the newly fortified streets. Jerusalem was alive again. Nehemiah called the leaders and the people to the open square before the newly restored wall. There, he read from the book of the law, the words of God that had been neglected for generations. As he spoke, a wave of realization washed over the crowd. Their restoration was not just physical, it was spiritual. They had rebuilt walls, yes, but now they were rebuilding hearts. Tears, laughter, and worship filled the air. The people understood that God had guided every decision, every act of courage, and every stone placed by hand. They recommitted themselves to God's law, pledging to live faithfully, to care for one another, and to honor the covenant of their ancestors. Enemies had tried to discourage them, fear had threatened to paralyze them, and the task had seemed impossible, but unity, faith, and leadership had prevailed. Nehemiah looked out over the crowd, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. He had not done this alone. Every man and woman who had worked, prayed, and persevered had played a part in this miracle. The city's gates now stood strong, its walls towering and secure, and Jerusalem itself seemed to pulse with new life. Traders, artisans, and families moved freely, no longer vulnerable to attack, no longer living in shame. The people had reclaimed their identity and their dignity. Nehemiah, standing atop the wall at sunset, whispered a prayer of gratitude. He had been just a cupbearer in a foreign palace, but God had called him for a purpose far greater than he could have imagined. Leadership was not about titles or comfort, it was about serving faithfully, trusting God, and inspiring others to act courageously. The story of Jerusalem's walls was now the story of a people renewed, a city rebuilt by faith, a nation strengthened by unity, and hearts forever changed by courage and determination. Nehemiah's legacy would live on, reminding generations that with God, nothing is impossible and that even the most broken places can rise again. And so, Jerusalem stood once more, not just with stone and mortar, but with hope restored, faith renewed, and a people united under God's plan, a timeless story of leadership, vision, and unwavering trust.